I'm going to start this video with a scary fact. Did you know that the number of active psychologists in the US in 2007 was just under 76,000? That number in 2023, over 207,000, from 76,000 to over 207,000. And yet the mental health of our children has consistently declined over those years. That's terrifying to me. While our colleges are pumping out more and more graduates with psychology degrees, our kids' mental health is declining. Something is wrong. In this video, I'm making the case for you, the parent, to place more emphasis on using your common sense when raising your kids, rather than relying heavily on these so-called highly educated, knowledgeable experts. I've made no secret of the fact that I believe our experts are failing us. They're failing our children. And the only way to turn the tide is to better understand what you, and only you as a parent, bring to the table when raising your kids. Parents are going to right this ship. And I believe that parents are going to do this with only occasional help from experts, using experts only when they're really needed. Because placing so much faith in experts is what's caused this problem in the first place. Let's inject some common sense into parenting. Your kids will thank you in the long run. Now, what do I mean when I say common sense is very misunderstood? Here's the reason. Because what's common for you may not be common for me. Let me give you an example. If you live in a cold weather state, northern Vermont, New Hampshire, New York, maybe Minnesota or North Dakota, if you live in one of those areas, it's common sense to have an emergency kit in your car that would include a sleeping bag, blankets, gloves, socks, probably an ice scraper, and a travel snow shovel. They'd likely be in that emergency kit. You see, in those cold weather areas, having those items in your car, in everyone's car, is just basic common sense. If you break down at night when it could drop to 0 degrees or worse, you could die without those items in your emergency car kit. Now, if you live in a state like Louisiana, Mississippi, or Florida, you won't have any of those cold weather items in your car emergency kit. Living in those places, common sense says that you wouldn't find any of those items necessary. Here's another simple example. Growing up in an urban environment, a city, versus growing up in a rural area. Picture living in central Tennessee, Kentucky, or Kansas. Common sense to a city kid compared to a country kid is completely different. Common sense behaviors that every kid has to learn to survive growing up in New York City, Philadelphia, or Chicago. It's basically the polar opposite of basic common sense growing up in, say, Central Texas or Wyoming. Common sense isn't really all that common quite often, unless it's applied in a very particular situation or in a very particular place regarding a very particular thing. Now, what does this have to do with parenting? A great deal. As a parent, the common sense you bring to your parenting is very important if you recognize that that common sense is specific to you and your child, where you live, how you live, the age of your child, who your child is. Basically, any and all of the specifics relating to you and your child. In one of my previous videos, I make the case that you are the real parenting expert, the only real parenting expert when it comes to your child. No one will ever know your child the way you do. No one. And a big part of that specific knowledge that only you have about your child has to do with common sense. Common sense in philosophy refers to a basic level of understanding that most people share, allowing them to make practical judgments without needing extensive theoretical knowledge. But common sense can vary greatly by region where you live, by culture, by religion, by ethnicity. This is a big part of why I place such little faith in traditional parenting experts. Many parenting experts are giving you generic advice based on their region, culture, religion, or ethnicity. It could be even worse if those experts don't even recognize those things, those differences, and they come up with some amalgamation, some generic blend of all those things. Who is that advice for? Your child is unique, one of a kind, and they deserve the attention and guidance and direction that addresses, takes into account their uniqueness. Now, when you're dealing with anyone that considers themselves an expert, they will almost universally badmouth common sense. And that makes sense because common sense comes from you. And in their learned opinion, only their superior knowledge and expertise can solve your problems. You can't solve your problems on your own. You need them and their expert advice when dealing with some issue. Now, many experts criticize common sense because they say it can be influenced by biases and cultural norms that could lead to incorrect conclusions. Common sense influenced by biases and cultural norms? Of course it is. Once you realize and accept that a great deal of what we call common sense isn't universal, you need to take the time to understand how your common sense solution may make little to no sense when compared to someone else's common sense solution. Why? Because the cultural norms in your community, the biases in your community, have a huge impact on the common sense solutions in your community. If you live in rural Nebraska and are reading a parenting book written by an author who was born and raised in New York City, how in the world is that individual going to have any understanding of your world, your child's world? How is that expert going to be able, in any way, to help you with some specific issue you're dealing with as a parent? That expert might be able to give you some basic, generic advice about parenting, but it's unlikely they'll ever be able to really understand you and your child and where you're coming from. You see, the reason behind our misunderstanding of what common sense is driven mostly by cultural norms and biases from things like region, religion, ethnicity, and culture. When an expert tells you that you shouldn't rely on common sense because it can be influenced by those biases, by cultural norms that could lead to incorrect conclusions, in my opinion, they're looking at common sense too generically. And the big problem with that is that when you get advice for a specific problem or issue you're dealing with as a parent, and then try to solve that specific issue or problem with some generic advice, well, what's the odds that's really going to work? Now, I understand why this misconception about common sense exists. Common sense is a broadly, universally accepted solution, but it only makes sense if you understand the specifics behind the situation that you're trying to apply the common sense to. Now, common, the definition, ubiquitous, often observed or encountered. Specific, what's the definition? Special, of a particular or exact sort. It's counterintuitive. When parents place so much reliance on some expert to help them with a parenting problem, without regard for the uniqueness of their child, that advice is more likely than not going to be bad advice. And because parents of the last few generations have placed so much value on advice from parenting experts, they're ultimately getting bad parenting advice, we've ended up with a mental health catastrophe that continues to get worse. You, mom and dad, know your child better than anyone else. You have to learn to pay close attention, trust your gut, and resolve the majority of your parenting problems with good old common sense. The reason I feel so strongly about my parenting concept of raising an independent, confident, good decision maker is that my ICD approach is really a guide. It's a guide for you to help challenge your child to be the best person they can be. And only you know best how to help them down that path. I don't know your son or daughter. I don't know where your child is when you consider their physical, intellectual, or emotional strength. What I do know is that wherever they are, it's your job as their parent to help build those strengths to best prepare them for life as an adult. I'm not a parenting expert. And even if I had some credential that somehow seemingly validated my parenting expert knowledge, I wouldn't be arrogant enough to try to tell you specifically how to raise your son or daughter, because I don't know your son or daughter. Yes, I've got certain specific advice for some things. Watch my video titled Manage the Screen Time Nightmare. I recommend very specific things you should do to help avoid the development of screen time addiction. There are many examples of specific suggestions and advice I have for you that any traditional parenting expert can give you. But the really important stuff, how to develop your child's core strengths, their physical, mental, emotional strengths, that stuff is mostly up to you. You can't outsource that to anyone. I can give you examples of things my wife and I did with our son to challenge him, to help build his strengths. But it's up to you to properly and appropriately challenge your son or daughter based on who and what they are. When my wife and I were encouraging our 15-year-old son to try his first NUE, National Ultra Endurance Mountain Bike Race, those were 100-mile races with somewhere around 10,000 feet of climbing in every race. That was very specific to him. You've got to find the things that challenge your son or daughter. No one else can do that for you. I can't. No one can but you. The common sense you bring to your parenting is based on your family, your culture, your community, the specifics about your life. Raising your own independent, confident, good decision maker means you're not relying heavily on someone else's advice with your parenting. You're relying on your specific knowledge of your child. ICD parenting is about showing you a goal, an end result that puts your child in their best position possible to take on the challenges of adulthood. It's about giving you suggestions about how to achieve that goal, to strengthen your child in all the ways that matter to best prepare them for their best life. The end game of being able to be truly independent, confident, and make more good decisions than bad ones, it's a long path, and it starts when your child is just a baby. If you're scratching your head thinking about the increase in active psychologists in this country from 76,000 in 2007 to 207,000 in 2023, wait till you hear this. According to the American Psychological Association, we need more psychologists. There's a shortage. Now, yes, psychologists provide a valuable service to many people that really need professional help to deal with some trauma. But, according to Abigail Shrier in her book Bad Therapy, there's a dark side to this massive growth in psychologists in this country. I strongly recommend every parent read her book. I put a link in the description. The most important thing for you to realize as a parent is that you shouldn't underestimate the power you have as a parent. Your common sense guidance regarding your child's development should be the most powerful influence in their lives. Don't give that power to someone else. Thanks for listening.